Good evening, how's everybody doing? Good to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. In fact, now with the clocks changing, it's already Erev Monday, Yom Sheni. Who's in the house on a Sunday night? Sharon in New Jersey, Joseph in Massachusetts, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in PA, Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, Paul and Nancy, North Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota. Joseph asking, who was that? That's Moshe Storch. I'm just working our way through that wonderful Hoshana Rabbah, Hallel and Hoshanas that we did at our shul with Moshe Storch leading us. We're very lucky to have him. He's, recorded albums and been featured on some very big songs in the Jewish world. Aoife in the house in Florida. Marjorie says shalom. Our daf tonight is page 79 here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We're opening with Mishna number 6 here in chapter 4. After we do tonight's page, God willing, we're only going to have 2.5 more pages in this tractate. And when we finish this tractate, we'll finish Seder Nashim. There are 6 Sedarim, 6 orders in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. And with this, we'll finish the third of them. Seder Nashim, these are the laws of women, as it were. But what we've been talking about is laws of betrothal, laws of marriage, laws of divorce, the Yavama, etc. And when we move to the next tractate, we'll be moving into the next order, the next Seder, which is called Nazikin, damages. And that will be tractate Bava Kama. And with that, we're going to really shift gears. So many of these laws, they're as relevant today as there ever were because of the spiritual content in them. But betrothal is really, not accomplished, let's say, in the same way in the modern world as it was in the ancient world. Once we move to Bava Kama, there we're going to be talking about the principles of business relationships, all right? Talking about rentals, paid watchmen, 2 people arguing over a piece of property, and the principles that are involved and the types of disputes that are involved and, the way people argue and they resolve their differences. As fresh as the day is long. Everything about it. Obviously some of the principles that we'll be using were developed thousands of years ago, but they're as relevant today, fully relevant today in everything that people do. And it's always a lot of fun when we move into Bava Kama. Okay, but let's keep our total focus here in Mishnah number 6 of chapter 4 here in Tractate Kiddushin. Mishnah 6. And we're at the bottom of page 78b. In a case of one who authorized his agent to betroth his daughter to a man that the agent would deem fit, right? This is like Abraham sending his servant Eliezer to go find a wife for his son Isaac, right? Very similar. Except that, Isaac was his son. He could have, and the big difference, if Abraham had a daughter and was sending Eliezer to betroth someone to his daughter, very big difference, because the father under Jewish law has the full right to find someone to betroth his daughter, right? She can reject the man that her father betroths her to in terms of marrying him. She will have that option. But her father has the full right to betroth her to someone, and then if she chooses to get out of that, then she's going to need a get, right? She's going to need a bill of divorce to end that. Although, I mean, in certain situations, she can basically annul it, and it's as if there was no betrothal. But that's besides the point for now. What we're talking about here is, as you'll see, where the father appoints someone to betroth a man to his daughter, and then the father, before that betrothal is accomplished, goes ahead and says, you know what, I got a better guy for my daughter, and he betroths that man directly. So now we have sort of a competition between the father's own betrothal on behalf of his daughter and the agent that he appointed to pursue the same task. So in a case of one who authorized his agent to betroth his daughter to a man that the agent would deem fit, and the father went and betrothed her to someone else. Okay, so if his betrothal preceded that of the agent, then his betrothal is a valid betrothal, because a woman can't be betrothed to more than one person, and the father betrothed her to someone before the agent betrothed her to someone, so that betrothal went first. And if the betrothal of his agent preceded his own, well, then the betrothal of the agent on behalf of the daughter is a valid betrothal. And if it is not known whose betrothal came first, what do you think is going to happen? We have a case of uncertainty. Since we don't know which betrothal happened first, the sages are going to say, okay, both of them have to divorce her, and we start over. Both men who might have been betrothed to her give her a get, a bill of divorce, in order to render her permitted to marry someone else. And if they wish, and they agree between them, one gives a bill of divorce and the other marries her, but they have to agree to that. And similarly, with regard to a woman who authorizes her agent to betroth her, and she then went and betrothed herself to someone else, if her own betrothal preceded that of the agent, her betrothal is a valid betrothal. And if that of her agent preceded her own, then the agent's betrothal is a valid betrothal. And if they did not know whose betrothal came first, both men who may have betrothed her give a bill of divorce. And if they wish, one may give her the get and the other marries her. That's the Mishnah. We're on 79a. Here's the Gemara on this Mishnah. And it is necessary to state this law with regard to one who betroths his daughter as well as with regard to a woman who betroths herself. Why? As had the Mishnah taught us this law only with regard to the father himself, one might say that it is because a man is expert with regard to lineage. And his decision to betroth his daughter on his own, after having appointed an agent, must have been due to the superior lineage of the man that he found willing to marry her. But with regard to a woman who is not expert with regard to lineage, one might say her betrothal should not be considered a valid betrothal, as she still intends for her agent to be able to accept betrothal for her from a man with superior lineage. And conversely, had the Mishnah taught us this law only with regard to the woman herself, one might say that it is because a woman is particular about whom she marries, i.e. she is careful when selecting a husband for herself. Therefore, she would have chosen the partner she deems most suitable and would not want the agent to act on her behalf after she had found someone on her own. But with regard to the father, one might say that he does not care to the same extent, and he may authorize the agent to act in any case. Therefore, it is necessary for the Mishnah to include both cases. You might have thought those situations, but that's why the Mishnah teaches both cases. Now, it was stated that the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, discussed the following question. If her father betrothed her on the way when he was traveling, and in the meantime, she betrothed herself in the city, right? So the father and the daughter don't know, that each was acting independently to obtain a betrothal for her. When he was traveling. In the meantime, she betrothed herself in the city, and now they add this additional condition. And she is now a grown woman. Right? Now, the father only has the ability to betroth her while she's still a minor. So now she becomes a grown woman. And of course, the question is, what do you mean now? When did she become a grown woman? We'll discuss that. So in this situation, Rav said, she is a grown woman at present, and her father cannot currently betroth her. Therefore, even if he did betroth her, at some point, his betrothal is assumed not to have taken effect. And Shmuel said, we are concerned with regard to the betrothal of both of them. So the issue is that the father and daughter were apart during the period where she aged out of being a minor and became an adult, right? And the father is not sure exactly when that happened and whether he had acted on her behalf to create a betrothal while she was still a minor or after she had become an adult. Now, this is all very, sort of colorful and relationship oriented. But the sages are actually going to use the discussion which follows in many other places of the Talmud, not so much about answering questions of was a betrothal created, was a betrothal not created, who are we going to get married, who's going to have to give a bill of divorce to who, but rather on this simple idea that, well, when we came out of the period of uncertainty, well, she was an adult and the father doesn't have the right to betroth her. And we're not sure when she reached that status, but now we know that she reached that status. So based on that, what we know about her right now, are we going to sort of interpolate uncertainty or not? Are we going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Attribute. Are we going to attribute uncertainty to that situation or not? So bear that in mind, that this discussion ends up getting used for other areas of the law quite frequently. Now, the Gemara clarifies the case. When did the father's betrothal of his daughter occur? If we say it occurred during the 6 months when the daughter was no longer a minor and had the status of a young woman, so in that case, Rav would say, or rather, would Rav say, is a question, would Rav say she is a grown woman at present? It is reasonable to say that it is only now that she has reached her majority, i.e. assumed the status of a grown woman, and in that case, her father's betrothal should take effect, since a father can betroth his daughter when she is a young woman. Now, Rav would not rule that the father's betrothal is disregarded. So rather, perhaps it occurred after the 6 months had elapsed, since she became a young woman. In that case, would Shmuel say we are concerned with regard to the betrothal of both of them? But doesn't Shmuel say the difference between the status of a young woman and the status of a grown woman is 6 months alone, after which the girl has the status of a grown woman, which means that her father can no longer betroth her. Now she can only betroth herself. So the Gemara answers no. It is necessary in a case where he betrothed her on the day that these 6 months were completed. Rav said, she is a grown woman at present. There is therefore a presumption that since she is now a grown woman, she was also a grown woman when her father betrothed her in the morning. And Shmuel said, well, perhaps it is only now that her signs indicating puberty have come, but she might have still been a young woman when her father betrothed her, in which case the father's betrothal is a valid betrothal, and we have to deal with it, that if she betrothed herself during this same period, there were 2 betrothals. We're not sure which one came first, and so both men have to agree to divorce her, or one has to agree to divorce her and the other one can marry her, but we have to deal with both betrothals. Whereas if we were able to set aside one of the betrothals because the father betrothed her when he was no longer qualified to betroth her because she had become a grown woman, then we would not have that issue of uncertainty. So the Gemara asks, and according to Shmuel, in what way is this case different from the case of a mikveh? Why are we talking about a mikveh? Because earlier, was it like maybe 10 pages ago, we had this discussion about a mikveh, right, where people immersed in it for various reasons, including to convert, or women who had finished their days of impurity related to menstruation, and then they immersed in the mikveh, and then they were, ready for mikveh night, as it were, when they become permitted to their husbands again. Right? But if it turned out later that a mikveh that everyone thought was a kosher mikveh, right, a qualified mikveh, turned out that it held less water than the minimum amount of water, So then it wasn't a kosher mikvah. And all the immersions that people were counting on to be kosher immersions in that mikvah weren't kosher. And so people who thought that they had been purified weren't. And that's a big problem, right? So that was a discussion that we were talking about. And why is it relevant here? Because the question then was, okay, right now that mikvah doesn't have enough water in it. At some point, people checked, and it did have enough water in it. So we know that somewhere, let's say between January and March, it became an unkosher mikvah. But we don't know where. We don't know when. We don't know when in that period. So are we going to say that all of the immersions between January and March were not kosher immersions? Or are we going to say all the immersions between January and March were kosher, except for the ones that were done on the day when it was discovered that the mikvah didn't have enough water in it? Or are we going to say that all those immersions that happened during that period have uncertain status? Let's go in. So the Gemara asks, and according to Shmuel, in what way is this case different from the case of the mikvah? As we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Mikvaos 2:2, with regard to a mikvah that was known to have contained the requisite 40 sa of water, which was then measured and found deficient in its quantity of water. So what is the law? All pure items whose purifications had been performed in it, i.e., any impure items that had been purified through immersion in this mikvah, retroactive to when the mikvah was last measured, whether the mikvah is found to be in a private domain or in a public domain, are impure. So they're saying, okay, all those immersions were not immersions. Anyone who was counting on having been purified wasn't purified. Well, this indicates that the current situation, i.e. the deficient mikvah, is presumed to extend back until when it was known with certainty to have contained the minimum amount of water. Well, then in this case, too, the woman should be considered a grown woman at the time of the first betrothal, and the second betrothal should not take effect, the one that her father did. In other words, the first betrothal took effect because it was her own betrothal, and the one of her father didn't take effect, both because it was second and because he had no ability to betroth her because she was a grown woman. Now, the Gemara answers, there, in the case of the mikvah, it is different. We can't compare these two cases. Why? Since it can be said, maintain an impure item in its hazaka, in its presumptive status, and say that it was not properly immersed, right? The items, let's say that this is a toivel mikveh, right? So this is just a mikveh that's used not for people, but for items, right? So for example, when we bring, new ceramic plates into a Jewish home, so before we can use them, we take them to the toivel mikveh, the mikveh that we immerse items in as opposed to people. Okay, so before those items were immersed in the mikveh, they were impure and not permitted for use in a kosher Jewish home. After they're immersed in the mikveh, they're prepared for use. So what they're saying is, okay, well, since we can't be sure that any of those immersions were proper immersions, that the plates that went into them retain the status they had before they were immersed, which in this case, they were impure before they were immersed, so they remain impure. How is that relevant to this? See if you can follow the logic. The presumptive status of the items being ritually impure is, wait a minute, let me make sure I'm in the right place. There, in the case of the mikveh, it is different, since it can be said, maintain an impure item in its presumptive status and say that it was not properly immersed. There, the presumptive status of the item being ritually impure is supported by the current state of the ritual bath, which is the mikveh, which is now deficient. So we say nothing was purified that went through it. So now the Gemara continues to compare that case to ours. But on the contrary, it could be said, wait a minute, before you make that assumption that we maintain the ritual status of everything that was impure before it was immersed, and we say we can't be sure that it was immersed properly, so everything remained impure. But on the contrary, it could be said, maintain the mikveh in its presumptive status, that it was known to have previously contained the requisite 40 sa of water, and say that it was not deficient at the time that those items were immersed in it, right? So why should we say maintain the presumptive status of the items that were immersed in the mikvah? Why not say preserve the presumptive status of the mikveh itself? We know that at some point it had enough water in it. Later down the line, we found that it didn't have enough water in it. We don't know when the water splashed out or became insufficient. So we should say that in terms of areas of uncertainty, preserve the presumptive status that the mikveh itself had before we found out that it was deficient. So the Gemara answers, well, right now we have a deficient mikveh. There's not enough water in it. And that counteracts the presumptive status that it contained the requisite 40 sa, at some point the last time it was measured. And the Gemara asks, well, here too. So they're saying, well, maybe now that we know there's not enough water, maybe we don't believe us. Whoever told us that it had enough water 2 months ago, maybe that person was wrong because the evidence is right now it's deficient. So here too, there is a grown woman before you, right? So that now we're getting back to this woman. We know that at some point she became an adult and the father lost his ability to betroth her to anyone. So right now she's a grown woman. There's a grown woman before us, which should counteract the fact that she was previously a young woman. And the Gemara answers, in this case, it is only now that she has reached her majority. And the Gemara asks, well, there too, in the case of the mikvah, one can also say that it is only now that it has become deficient. Perhaps it did contain the requisite 40 sa of water earlier in time. So the Gemara responds, there, in the case of the mikvah, there are two reasons to weaken the possibility that the items that were immersed in it during that period of uncertainty have become ritually pure. First, there is a deficient mikveh at present. We know that right now the mikveh doesn't have enough water in it. And secondly, the item that went into it and was immersed had a presumptive status of impurity before it was immersed. That's why it was immersed. Here, by contrast, in the case of this young woman, there is only one reason to weaken the possibility that she was a young woman at the time of the betrothal, i.e. the fact that she is now a grown woman. So Shmuel therefore maintains that her earlier status of young woman is not nullified, and therefore both betrothals must be taken into account. And it might be that she was, that two valid betrothals happened, and we just don't know which happened first, and that's why both men have to divorce her so she can go marry someone else, or they agree between them who's going to marry her, and the other guy divorces. Now, the Gemara poses another question, and according to Shmuel, right, Rav and Shmuel are having a debate about this. And according to Shmuel, in what way is this case different from the case of a barrel? Another situation where we have some deficiency now, we don't know when it happened, and we have to deal with it. What is the deficiency here? Wine turned into vinegar. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta, Terumos 2:8, if one would inspect the contents of a barrel to see if it still contained enough wine to continually mentally separate terumah from it, not that it turned to vinegar, but the question is, did we separate the terumah, right? Did we separate the tithe from this barrel, right? And maybe what we were saying is we have several barrels before us, and it was my intention to use the contents of one of these barrels to tithe for the other barrels. But then it turns out that there's not enough wine in that barrel. So let's continue. As it is taught in Bryce, if one would inspect the contents of a barrel to see if it still contained enough wine to continually, mentally separate terumah from it, right, the first tithe that's given to the priests, in order to exempt other untithed wine that he had in other barrels, until all the wine in that barrel would be terumah and would be given to a priest, and afterward, this is what I'm saying, and afterward the contents of the barrel were found to be vinegar, which cannot be set aside as terumah for untithed wine. Okay, then all 3 days after he had last inspected it is definitely viewed as having been wine, and any untithed wine for which terumah was separated during those days is tithed. From then onward, more than 3 days after the previous inspection, it is uncertain as to whether it had already turned to vinegar, and any untithed wine for which terumah was separated during those days is not tithe. In other words, if you did this the right way, right, and you separated wine, for like the 2% of your wine, you have this big, vintage of wine that you harvested and pressed and prepared and put into barrels. And you're going to put aside 2% of that wine as terumah. So once you've separated it, okay, that's the terumah barrel. I have to deliver it to a priest, but I've separated the terumah. If that terumah, turns into vinegar, okay, well, sadly the terumah turned to vinegar, but it was properly separated and, conditions were that it turned into vinegar. But if it turns to vinegar before you actually make the declaration that this is terumah, well, then you can't use vinegar to tithe for wine. So that's the issue here. So before stating the difficulty with Shmuel's opinion, so the question is, when did it become vinegar, right? What assumption can we make? What presumptive status did it have? So before stating the difficulty with Shmuel's opinion, the Gemara first clarifies this baraisa. And we raised a contradiction between the law of the barrel and that of the mikvah. What is different in that here, with regard to the mikvah, the law is that the items are definitely impure, the ones that were immersed in that mikvah. We say they're impure because they were not purified in a mikvah of uncertain status. And what is different in that there, with regard to the barrel, that it is only uncertain whether the produce remains untithed? Why don't we say, we can't be certain that it was tithed properly, so we're going to say that the rest of the produce is definitely untithed. Why don't we do that? And in both cases, the situation at present, that the mikveh is deficient and that the contents of the barrel, having turned to vinegar, should lead to a definite conclusion. And yet we have different outcomes in the case of the mikveh versus the case of the barrel. So the Gemara continues its analysis. And Rav Hanina from Syria says, who is the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnah, that taught the law of the barrel? Well, that was Rabbi Shimon, who, with regard to a mikvah, also considers it a matter of uncertainty rather than as definitively impure. Therefore, there is no contradiction between the baraisa and the Mishnah. As it is taught in a baraisa, all pure items whose purification had been performed in it, i.e., any impure items that had been purified through immersion in the mikveh that was found to be deficient, retroactive to when the mikveh was last measured, whether this mikveh is found in the private domain or in the public domain, are impure, right? Because we don't know when it became an unkosher mikveh, so everything that was immersed during that period we declare it impure. That's what the majority of the rabbis say. And Rabbi Shimon says they are impure due to the uncertainty. And therefore, if the mikveh was located in the public domain, they are pure, in accordance with the principle that uncertain cases of impurity in the public domain are deemed pure. But if the mikveh was located in the private domain, then the decision is suspended, i.e., the impure items came into contact. If impure items came into contact with terumah, one may not partake of the terumah due to the uncertainty, but it is also not burned as though it were definitely impure. Now, the Gemara returns to complete the difficulty with Shmuel's opinion. But according to the rabbis, who hold that in the case of the mikveh, the items became definitely impure, or rather remained impure, because we can't say with certainty that they were purified by immersing in a kosher mikveh. Now, with regard to the wine that had been exempted from terumah by means of separating terumah from the contents of the barrel, the wine will be untithed produce retroactively, since they hold that the current status extends into the past. Okay, so now the barrel of wine is consistent with the case of the mikveh. Now, this is unlike the ruling of Shmuel, who ruled that in the case of the woman who was betrothed to two men, it is uncertain to whom she is betrothed. And the Gemara answers there, in the case of the barrel, it is different, as it can be said, maintain the untithed produce in its presumptive status, as when it first grew, it was definitely untithed, and say that it was not fixed, i.e. it was not exempted by separating terumah for it. So the Gemara asks, on the contrary, why not maintain the wine in its presumptive status and say that it had not turned to vinegar? You see, we're talking about different presumptive statuses. Are we going to say, well, the untithed produce had a presumptive status of being untithed, since we're not sure that we separated wine properly in order to tithe it, it maintains its untithed status? Or do we say, no, follow the wine in the barrel. It had a presumptive status of being wine and not vinegar. We don't know when it turned into vinegar, so let's remain with the presumptive status that it had. Where are we going to direct our presumptive status assumption, right? To what was going to be considered tithe because of it, or to the wine in the barrel? On the contrary, why not maintain the wine in its presumptive status and say that it had not turned to vinegar? And the Gemara rejects that. This is impossible. As we know, it became vinegar. So we can't say that, well, it was wine until a certain point. We don't know what that point is. We know that it's vinegar now. So we have to presume that it was vinegar all the way back to when we know for sure that it was wine. Now, the Gemara replies to this argument. In the case of the betrothal, here too, she is a grown woman at present. So what is the difference? The Gemara says, with regard to the woman, it is possible that only now has she reached her majority. And the Gemara challenges, well, here too, it could also be said that only now did the wine turn into vinegar, not earlier. And the Gemara explains, there in the case of the barrel, there are two reasons to weaken the possibility that the wine is tithed. First, the tithing wine is vinegar right now. And second, the wine that we were tithing with this barrel of wine that turned into vinegar, the rest of the wine that we're using this barrel to tithe, that had a presumptive status of being untithed. So now we have two reasons to say that, well, this barrel of wine that turned into vinegar did not exempt the rest of the wine by tithing for it, because we have two challenges to the presumptive status. Okay, what about the case of the young woman? Do we not have two challenges there? Gemara seems to be saying no. The Gemara suggests, let us say that it is parallel, this whole question is parallel to a dispute between the Tanaim in yet another case. Now we're going to 79b. The law is that a moribund person, right, a person who's on death's door, he's very ill and he's about to die, and so we limit his ability, we enhance his ability to dispose of his property because he's on his deathbed and he's not going to be able to do everything contractually, the way it needs to be done. But on the other hand, we're going to, not give a blanket, permit for him to just give away anything with just an oral contract when normally would require a written contract. So let's see how this works. The law is that a moribund person who transfers all of his property to others without leaving anything for himself can retract his bequest, if he regains his health. And this is due to the assumption that one would give away all his possessions only if he believes he is going to die. And the bequest was therefore made in error. He thought he was going to die. He didn't die. So he wouldn't have given it away if he knew he wasn't going to die. By contrast, if a healthy person gave all of his property to others, he cannot later retract his bequest. Now, the Tanaim discussed the case of one who gave away all his property and later, seeking to retrieve his property, he claims that he was moribund at the time, while the recipients of the bequest maintain that, no, you were not at death's door. Yeah, maybe you had a flu, but you didn't think you were dying. You gave away all your property like a healthy person does, and so you can't take it back. Now, who is able to remove the property from the possession of whom? What do we do in such a case? Now we're getting a peek of the kind of cases we'll be dealing with in Seder Nazikin. So he is able to remove his property held by others from their possession without needing to bring proof that he was moribund at the time. And they may not remove the property from his possession if he is still in possession of the property without proof that he was healthy. This is the statement of Rabbi Yaakov. Rabbi Nassan says, if he is currently healthy, the obligation is upon him to bring proof that he was on his deathbed at the time of his bequest. And if he is now on his deathbed, the obligation is upon the other people to bring proof that he was healthy at the time of his bequest. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that Rav spoke in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan that one's current status is paramount. And Shmuel spoke in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yaakov, who holds that the question of whether he was moribund remains a matter of uncertainty, and they may not claim the property from him even if he is now healthy. So the Gemara rejects this comparison. Rav could have said to you, I spoke even in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yaakov, as Rabbi Yaakov states his opinion only there, because it can be said that the principle of leave the property in its previous status applies, so that the property should remain where it is. But here, with regard to the question of when a young woman became a grown woman, shall we say establish the body according to its previous status? It is obvious that her body was about to mature. And Shmuel could have said, right, because property doesn't change hands unless something is done to it. But a young woman becomes an adult woman in the course of nature. And Shmuel could have said, I spoke even in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, since Rabbi Nassan states his opinion that the current state is paramount only there, as everyone has a presumptive status of being healthy. Consequently, if a person removes himself from this presumption by claiming he was moribund, the obligation falls upon him to bring proof. But here, does she remove herself from a presumption that was present? There is no presumption that she was a grown woman in the morning. So this Gemara further suggests, let us say that this dispute between Rav and Shmuel is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim with regard to a case where her father betrothed her on the way when he was traveling, and in the meantime she betrothed herself in the city, and she is now a grown woman. So one Baraisa taught she is a grown woman at present, and her father cannot currently betroth her, therefore his betrothal does not take effect. And it is taught in another Baraisa, we are concerned with regard to the betrothal of both of them. So what? Is it not that case that one Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rav, and the other Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel? That sounds like it, but this is where we have to be always so careful, right? Like sometimes you have an analogy, and it's like, that works, that analogy works. Now I understand what's going on. But the analogy is a little bit imprecise, and if your thinking is not precise, you can really go askew. And here the Gemara shows why this analogy does not work. The Gemara says, no, it is possible that both this and that are in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. Here in this Baraisa, it is referring to a case where she denies his right to betroth her, as she claims that she was a grown woman before his betrothal. There it is referring to a situation where she does not deny her father's right to betroth her, and therefore it is uncertain which betrothal takes effect. And the Gemara asks, and I'm almost done, questions or comments, please get them in. So the Gemara asks, if so, let us also say that since the Baraisas do not disagree, the opinions of the Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel, do not disagree either. One is referring to a case where she denies her father's right to betroth her, while the other is referring to a case where she does not. But the Gemara rejects that approach. And how can you understand it that way? But Rav Yosef, the son of Rav Menashe of Dabil, performed an action in this case in accordance with the opinion of Rav, and did not take the father's betrothal into account. And Shmuel took offense at this ruling and said sarcastically, is wisdom measured out to everyone in a small measure and measured out to this member of the sages in a large measure? He was angered that Rav Yosef had the audacity to rule against him in this case. Now, if it enters your mind that they did not disagree at all, why did Shmuel take offense? Perhaps when Rav Yosef performed an action, he did so in an instance where the woman denied her father's right to betroth her, in which case even Shmuel would agree that the father's betrothal did not take effect. Rather, it must be that Rav and Shmuel did disagree, and Rav Yosef must have ruled in the case of a woman who did not deny her father's right to betroth her, which explains why Shmuel took exception to his ruling. And so finally, to end the discussion of Mishna number 6, Mar Zutra said to Rav Ashi, this is what a Maimar said. The law is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. And Rav Ashi said, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav. take a couple questions on Kiddushin 79. Tom, no credit for good faith, unwitting errors? I think referring, Nina says that this question was referring to the presumptive status of the mikvah. I mean, it was interesting, right? Like, you could take that other approach. Like, the ruling is that since the mikvah now is deficient, and we know only that it was a proper mikvah 2 months ago, and that there were all these items that were immersed in the meantime, and so the ruling is those items did not become purified. Right? It's a big deal because if somebody immersed a vessel, and then that vessel was used to transport terumah, and terumah can only be eaten by a priest if it's in a pure state. So now we would say that all that terumah that was transported in that vessel that we thought was pure but actually was rendered impure once this deficient mikvah was revealed, then all that terumah was ruined. It's a really big deal. Now maybe that's the sort of default position, but somebody, obviously somebody introduced the argument, at least it was a minority opinion, that said, okay, but we can say that the mikveh itself had a presumptive status of being full, and if we could adduce some further evidence, like, well, the last time it was measured was in January, but, there was an earthquake at the end of February. The last time it was measured was in January, but we all remember there was an earthquake at the end of February. So maybe if we've known in the past that the only time the mikvahs become deficient is when there's an earthquake, so maybe we would have an additional reason to rely on the presumptive status of the mikveh itself rather than rely on the presumptive status of the impure items that were immersed in it. But in the absence of such extenuating circumstances, it seems like no credit given for unwitting errors. Joseph, is presumptive status similar to retroactive designation? Excellent question. And the answer is these laws can intersect and have a bearing on each other, but they're not the same. Right? Presumptive status is, it's known as a chazaka, right? And chazaka is also used like when we establish a pattern, kind of has a similar result. But here the word chazaka is being used to say, well, this is the last, at a certain point we know what the status of, and so it retained that presumptive status, until we have a reason to know that it lost it. And so during that period of uncertainty, we talk about that presumptive status. Retroactive designation, right, which Rabbi Meir holds, and who was it? Maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't, I can't remember. But it was that idea that, something that we're going to tithe later and we're going to retroactively designate that the portion that we're separating now, it's as if we separated it earlier. That's one example of retroactive designation. So I would say the laws intersect, but they're not the same. Tom, what if you use an impure item because of this? Or a husband and wife had intimate relations and then found out that the mikvah had been deficient. Then what happens? Well, luckily, we don't hold like Rabbi Akiva, right? Because Rabbi Akiva said that if a baby is conceived between a man and woman when she's a nida, that the baby would be a mamzer. But we don't hold like Rabbi Akiva, right? On that issue. So there, the baby status would be, it would have unflawed lineage. There would be no problem with the baby. But, when the temple is standing, the husband would have to bring a sin offering for the unwitting violation of cohabiting with a nida, right? A woman whose menstrual status she hasn't observed her clean days and then immersed in the mikvah, because it would turn out that her immersion was not an immersion. I guess nowadays you would say, oh, we made a mistake, honey. We thought. Now she has to go immerse in a mikvah because her immersion was not an immersion. And so until she does, the husband and wife would remain prohibited to each other. In other words, you have to deal with the issue, but it's not a tragic issue. Right? Sharon, I don't know specifically about Kohanim, but in the book of Ruth, they refer to drinking vinegar with roasted grain, but I guess you had to designate it as it was first produced. Right, we're not saying that vinegar is useless, but they are saying that you can't use vinegar to tithe for wine, right? Because vinegar presumably has a lower value than wine. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.